So what we're going to try to do this afternoon is try to bring together everything that you heard all day. I don't know about you, but this has been an emotional day. It's been an incredible day. How many of you felt truly emotional this morning as the pianist talked, and right after, wasn't it incredible? She was amazing. So it's rare, I think, in a conference when the audience members feel deeply moved and as though they're deeply plumbing their own emotions and their own, how they stand as a parent and as a child, and to think of the childhood that they had. For me, that's what this morning and this afternoon's speakers brought to bear, and I think it's remarkable. So let's give the scientists a hand for what they were able to do today. So what we'd like to do now is to have a conversation, not just of each person giving views, but a genuine conversation about the core issue that Vicki started with this morning, and that each and every one of the speakers brought their points to bear on in their own talks. We've been talking about this notion of the whole child. And instead of trying to look at the child as a collection of pieces that have to do with language or certain cognitive skills or a social skill, an emotional skill, a set of skills, but as a whole child. And that has implications for theory and how we think about the child, but also how we think of ourselves as part of the human race. What does it mean to be human? In some way, each of the speakers on this panel were taking their own ideas to address this thought that, what is the core essence of what it means to be a human being? And how does that contribute to the whole child? And when you think of it in that way, you have to bring yourself to wonder, what does that whole child need? So we'll start on this panel by having each of the speakers contribute and discuss with one another, what does it mean, this concept of the whole child? And how does it change what we're going to do next? So let me just throw that open to you to comment on, any one of you, and we'll just pick up on each other's thoughts and put it in context for the audience as we try to wrap up such an incredible day. Who wants to start? We have not rehearsed this. It's going to be more fun that way. It's going to be more fun that way.
I'll start.
Go ahead.
Because it certainly has implications for education. Because now schools tend to not focus on the whole child. They focus on academics. And we can drop all the other stuff, right? It's all frills. They don't need time to play. They don't need recess. They don't need the arts. They just need academics. But if we're right that each of the parts is important for any one part to flourish, then it's wrong-headed to think that we can have the best academic outcomes if we only focus on academic instruction. And so it's really a revolutionary idea in education, or going back maybe to the way education was a couple hundred years ago. To have to focus on the social needs of the child, the physical activity needs of the child, the emotional needs of the child, if you want the best cognitive results out of education.
We've been thinking, wonderful, that was wonderful. We've been thinking about the brain as being in compartments too. The social part of the brain is on the right side, and logic and language is on the left side. And this sense of compartments and modules and everything in its own box has potentially led to some of this thinking. But now, is it turning around? Is she right? I mean, is Adele right? It's turning around. Go ahead, Peter.
I think it's an understatement that it's turning around. I think it's swinging round,
okay,
because we are beginning to recognize how important it is for each of us to feel recognized as a person in order to be able to actually access the information that's all around us. As information that we have to take on board increases in volume, our capacity to absorb will become increasingly, need to be increasingly prioritized to particular areas. We won't be able to learn everything. We'll have to be selective. So what it is that you select and who it is that you select from. And I think here, what is critical is that the person should feel recognized in order for their mind to open up to all the information that's around them. it's I think, obvious in some ways that we only listen to people who seem to relate to us. And I think, and I'm convinced about this, that the community that we are trying to form, that to create around the child, is perhaps a recreation of a community that could have existed a few hundred years ago, but that was blown apart by the disruptions to the family system. But I think increasingly we're recognizing that in childcare, in any way that we need to look after our young, we need to do so with the community. And I think, to me, the solution to many of the problems is in creating the community that has the whole child in mind at the center. What bit of social engineering will achieve this?
Yes, Art, can we make an economic argument for the whole
Art
child?
has an answer
totally
here.
agree, but we start with the whole child, no question, but I would argue it's the whole family.
Okay.
And that we can,
Yes.
and that we can intervene. We can, and we are intervening in a successful way. That is, we know that human interaction is so critical, starting as early as prenatal, and we can enhance that, especially for our most vulnerable families. So while I clearly agree on the whole child, I think we have to think whole family, and then if we're really good, then it's a whole community.
Exactly.
And how we engineer that, that's trickier. We're having some success on that, but I think the most success we're having, based on a lot of the research that you've heard, is working with the whole. It may just be one parent, it may be an extended family to some extent, but it's critical that we get that whole family involved.
Go ahead, Pat.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that we used to not have answers to questions about, well, why does that work? Why are we doing it this way? And then there would be some sort of a decision to change something, policy change, whatever it was, or an educational system change, who knows what. And part of it is based on the fact that we struggled for a long time to recognize that what we're talking about, just like we're talking about cardiac function, right, in very specific ways, or the function of our pancreas to control the glucose levels in our blood, we now talk about the brain and everything that it embodies in terms of everything we talked about today. So we know why physical exercise is important. We actually know why. It actually changes the chemistry of the brain. It changes the structure of the brain at a microscopic level. 20 years ago, we would scratch our heads and say, well, it seems to be. It's effective. Well, why? Why should we keep doing this? And so I think neuroscience has really facilitated the ability for us to start talking about this in ways where it really has a biological basis for the behaviors, the complex behaviors that we're
Although I'm
talking
going
about.
to push back on that. Go ahead. I spoke already.
Well, I was going to say that I think that one of the stunning things about all of the talks is the emphasis on relationships. Across all the talks, that really was an emphasis that everyone had. And I think neuroscience and thinking about the brain is now catching up to that. Yes. We used to think about the brain as a particular, it's in the pineal gland. Right. Or it was in this particular area. But now the new neuroscience does not accept that anymore.
No.
Correct.
You have to have interconnectedness. You have to understand networks. You have to learn graph theory and small world networks to understand how different parts of the brain are communicating with each other. And they are, in some sense, following what we've heard today about the importance of interconnectedness and social relationships. And the two are now reflecting one another.
It's incredible, I think, that the neuroscience, allowing us to see the whole brain, has certainly coaxed us to believe, as Nathan has said, that everything is active. It's as though that it's a busy conversation in the brain with all of these areas, as the time, now that we can see over time in magnetoencephalography and some of these newer brain imaging techniques, you can actually see movies of what's happening in a baby brain and in a parent brain as they interact. It's absolutely incredible. and bringing us to a new understanding of what it really means to say face-to-face is special. And I wonder how many of you remember when Ruth was talking in her conversation with us today about how one of the most remarkable things she said was that the parent is brought into a kind of sensitive period at birth. I thought that was a wonderful thing to imagine, that we've been talking about sensitive periods in childhood and in development, but I had not heard that the parent is brought into a sensitive period where they're more malleable by experience during that birthing and the period right after. Tell us a little bit more about that, Ruth. I think that's a phenomenally important thing to keep in mind.
Right. I think the first studies are in animal models. I forgot the researcher. It will probably come to me later, that showed in rodents that both the hippocampus and the amygdala and the connection with the prefrontal cortex is much more plastic when you become a parent for both male and female. And we see it in human parents where the experience is really changing the parental brain in the first year of life, which is a sensitive period for humans. It's between gestation and weaning in animals and between early pregnancy and the end of the first year.
Up the level a little bit. We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Yeah.
So between early pregnancy and the end of the first year of life for human, it's the period of plasticity for the parents when there are a lot of changes. And because we now know that the oxytocin system is a system that's implicated in plasticity at both the molecular and the network assembly level for the various reason of the features of the oxytocin system. And this is the period when the parent's brain is rather full of oxytocin. So this leads to enhanced plasticity in the parental brain.
I mean, that's a message that parents really, young parents are often afraid, you know, how am I going to be as a parent? The idea that you are, there's a special thing happening in your own brain as you become a parent that makes you more sensitive to developing that relationship and adjusting your behavior based on how it's going with your child. I think that's a very hopeful message. And it reminds me of Alicia's comments about the dyad. You took us through a very, very deep thought exercise with your examples from the child and the mother and the therapist and their interaction to make us think about how deep the sense of emotion that's going on between parent and child and how that allows us to build or not build a successful beginning.
And I would like to refer to something else that Ruth said, which is that experience of the oxytocin release occurs whenever there is an intimate relationship. And it isn't necessarily only between a parent and a child, but also between people who are relating closely to each other. And it brings me to how important it is for childcare providers to be given an opportunity to relate to the children that they take care of, so that that physiological experience of intimacy can be enacted vis-a-vis the children. And here I think that there is a very important connection between neuroscience and social policy, because the sad reality is that childcare providers make on average $24,000 a year, and it is they are at the bottom of the scale of payments in the entire country. And as a result, there is a great deal of turnover. And we know that children are scared of separation and loss, and that they need to be loved. Childcare providers who are constantly immersed in the sense of need about how are they going to make ends meet, etc., cannot be there for children in the way we want them to be. And so I think it's really
It's extremely important that we arm people with the knowledge of the power that they have as they interact with children, whether that's parents or caregivers.
And just to continue on this thought, as when we started working with fathers, especially fathers that let's say, depressed mothers or fathers that weren't very involved, a lot of time we would hear that fathers did not believe that they're so meaningful to the children. And you actually had to really tell them from research, from experience, that fathers make unique and very important contribution. And I think we should be doing the same for child care providers.
Yes.
And telling them and showing them and doing research from neuroscience, from behavioral science, from longitudinal studies.
And
that the child care
advocating with legislature for more higher salaries for so that social knowledge really come together in social justice.
One of the things that the Sims-Mann Foundation is doing that I think is a step forward is to bring a kind of certification to the learning process so that people who are going to be working with children, so parents of course, but the caregivers, the people who are going to be on the front lines in our daycares, in our preschools, that they have an educational system that brings them this knowledge. Most colleges of education do not package this information or present it at all to people who are heading into the field of education. So I think by taking these programs into the community colleges and the state universities and making a certification program, it will raise the salaries, it will raise the respect, and ultimately that will bring our best young people into the profession. When you travel worldwide, like many of us do, you find that other countries have a great deal more respect for those who are teaching the youngest children. In Stockholm, I was meeting with a group of young women and men who were preparing for a field education with the youngest kids. And they were saying that they're respected as much as any scientist in a laboratory doing kind of bench research. And I told them it's a completely different scenario here in the United States, and they were completely puzzled.
In the Netherlands, preschool and kindergarten teachers used to get the highest salary and be required to get the most years of education. And it's not just, I think, daycare and preschool, it's also early elementary school, because elementary school teachers are paid a little bit better than daycare, but they're not paid very well. Right. But you look at the nations that always do the best in the PISA test, that across the world children get in 4th grade and later, and the countries that do the best are Finland, and usually a country from Southeast Asia like Korea. Well, what do Finland and South Korea have in common? Not a lot. But one thing they have in common is that the teachers are hugely respected. Right. In fact, it's so hard to get into teacher training in Finland that the rejects go into what I do. They go into research. It's true. And they're paid really well, and they're really highly respected. So the two countries that come out on top are the ones where teachers are highly respected and highly paid. We should think about that.
I think the study that I'd like perhaps Art to do to demonstrate that if there is a linear relationship, which I predict there is, between the salaries that preschool teachers and childcare workers get paid in any country and the level of violence in that country. Because what we have found in the UK was that the government about 15 years ago, maybe now 12, 13 years ago, brought in a real increased emphasis on early years education and early years intervention. It didn't seem to make any difference whatsoever at the time. It was written up as a washout. What we are looking at now, and nobody can really properly explain, is a drop in violent crime at a time when actually, by all other social indicators, there should be an increase in violent crime in terms of unemployment and all the other indicators. I think, and many of us are convinced about it, that what early years education assures, and why this is so important, because it establishes in the mind of the child a clear and coherent image of other people in their social world as psychological mental entities. And one thing that you can't do when you can think of someone else as a person with thoughts, feelings, wishes, beliefs, and desires is to physically hurt them. It's so much easier when you don't have to think of them as people. So It's a very simple empirical test that only an economist can do. But I leave it to you as the Sims Man challenge.
Well, two of the studies that I cited, Perry and then the Child Parent Center studies in Chicago, both saw significant drops in crime 30, 40 years out. So we've already got that evidence. We are tracking that in the Twin Cities, those kind of statistics. Give me 10 years, we'll have it. But it's a little off the topic, but related. What I take away from much of this research is what's so critical is this human interaction.
Right.
And I don't know how we explain why that makes a difference, but I've had some pressure from Apple executives to try to introduce iPads into some of our vulnerable families, and I reject it based on this research.
Right.
I don't want to substitute from the parent and use that as an excuse not to deal with the parent, not to deal with the child. And again, you guys are going to have to tell me exactly why that human interaction seems to be so effective. But that's my argument for why we have to get to the family and improve that interaction, and that makes a huge difference, not just in terms of less need for special ed and less retention, but 30, 40 years out, we have seen a dramatic decline in crime.
Right.
And my best explanation of that is they had this human interaction. And if you think about it, I can tell you from my career and went to one of the best economics departments in the world at the University of Minnesota, I learned more interacting with my professors on one-to-one
That's right.
than anything else.
Okay, so Art, you anticipated my next question. So after getting everyone on the panel to attest to their deep belief about relationship being the core of all of social, emotional, and cognitive learning, I was going to put the problem on the table, which is, okay, why are we so addicted to our technologies? What is it doing to us? What is it doing to our relationships to children? And not necessarily that the people on this panel do research on the effects of technology on learning and relationships, but I think we need to get everyone to weigh in about what is that about. I mean, I think the answer to Art's question is going to be revealed someday. We will see, because we are doing studies in the neuroscience laboratories now. We're doing them in my own laboratory. What is it about face-to-face communication? What happens when you're face-to-face with another human being, adults and adult child, that changes what's going on in the brain? And something does change. We'll have an answer. But in the meanwhile, you go into a restaurant. My husband and I always take bets when a family of 4 comes into the restaurant, 2 kids and 2 adults, and they've all got their devices, and we take bets as to whether they'll lay the devices down when the food comes. And we've run this 100 times. And more often than not, the devices are momentarily put aside while the food is there, but then it's while the phone and whatever other the iPads that the kids have are then again engaged. There's got 4 people. They're in a round, semicircular,
But they might as
a
well
table, and they're still on the devices. What is that about? What does it mean? So anybody, let's take that up. Why?
Well,
And what are we going to do about it?
Before they answer that, I just want to say that relationships, interactions, live interactions, that's an evolutionarily conserved mechanism.
Exactly.
We know that from the way that songbirds learn what they have to learn in order to mate. So this may be seem off, you know this work.
I know this work.
You know this work. A male juvenile has to learn the specific mating song for that species of songbird. Otherwise, they don't mate.
Right.
Big problem for the species. So how do they learn it? Well, who do they learn it from? Well, they learn it from the male. They learn it from the father. Specific song. And there are very clever studies that scientists did to basically, well, let's record the song and play it back. And the songbirds don't learn the song at all, the juveniles. Let's be really clever. Let's take a microphone, stuff it in the back of a bird, a stuffed bird, sitting on the perch with the juvenile. Figuring, well, it's a bird. How smart can a bird be? It's a stuffed bird, right?
Bird brain.
And they learn a little bit of it. It's very fragmented and very ineffective in attracting the female songbird of the right species. It's only with a live tutor. Those are birds that recognize how important interactions and relationships are, and that's tapping into a cognitive component, right? And this is, when it's that conserved, across species. It's so fundamental to how species interact with each other and develop these very important skill sets for survival and for thriving. So we kind of know that this is really,
kinda
really,
know, but-
really
Pat can
critical.
Pat, you can tell us, no, the language Pat.
Oh.
Can tell us about the study.
Yes, I was just going to
About
say.
the study that looked at the differences in the way infants learn a second language,
Right.
whether or not they
It's a real person on the video.
watched a real person or heard a real person, or they watched them on TV
Exactly.
on a video.
Is he allowed to ask you a question?
Maybe people in the audience have heard of
Go,
this
no,
example.
go.
But we exposed 9-month-old babies for the first time to a foreign language in Seattle. And it was either Spanish in one set of experiments or Mandarin in another. And we were trying to understand how babies are learning during that sensitive period in which they're changing from universal citizens of the world, being able to understand and differentiate the sounds of all languages, to very focused listeners who are doing that only for their own language, which is what all the adults in the culture are doing by that time. So when you expose babies to this new language in a social setting at 9 months, they learn so amazingly. They match the kids in the foreign country to whom they're being compared. So phenomenal learning over 12 sessions over a month's time, less than 5 hours of experience, produces phenomenal learning, but only when children are face-to-face with their foreign language playmates, right? So the TV condition, which fooled us all, the graduate students and I were taking bets as to how much they were going to learn in live versus televised versus audio only and watching a teddy bear on the screen. And because the babies crawled up to the television set and touched it, and one baby kissed it, and they would stare intently at the screen, the graduate students were taking bets that the TV condition would produce the best learning. It was so simple, it was so clear, it was so beautiful. And the social setting was so messy, and the other kids and parents and talking and toy holding, and what happens? The babies in the social complex, messy situation were genius learners, and the babies in the TV condition learned nothing. The babies in the audio condition learned nothing. They were exactly comparable to the kids in the control group who had heard only English. Okay, so it's the social brain. The social brain is the gateway to everything, to all of cognition. And when you start, that was a decade ago that we learned that. It completely transformed my belief about the child and the brain, and it completely revised my thinking, and has huge implications for what we're doing with kids now.
But what I think both the examples really clearly show is how important it is to have contingent feedback at the same time alongside, in order for the learner to be certain that what they're learning is relevant to them, can be generalized to other situations. This is a single example from my own history of the teacher that I was most influenced by during my primary school education. She was a fantastic teacher. We all thought that she was fantastic. One thing that she did at the end of each year, she gave all of us a book that she said, this book was for you. I've selected it. It's for you personally because I've been teaching you. I know this is something that you'll enjoy reading. And we all thought she was wonderful. It took me the best part of 2 years on an analytic couch to figure out why I got the book that I got.
Did you figure?
I figured it out. She gave them out randomly.
Randomly.
But this strategy of setting up a contingent relationship with the pupil, saying, I have you in mind, I'm responding to you as a whole person, actually opens a kind of an epistemic superhighway in all our minds, and maybe in a bird's mind as well. I didn't think about that before, but it could well be that it's evolutionarily preserved like that, because we need to all learn who we can learn from. And that is why I am absolutely convinced that setting up contingent relationship with one's child, and I don't think it has to be a parent, it doesn't have to be, but it has to be someone who knows that person as a whole person, is so incredibly important in terms of allowing us to really make the best of what we have of ourselves in terms of being human beings in order to learn from our social experience.
Who was it today who showed us a picture of, I think, was a parent and a child and said that this dyad is about you and it's about me? Was it you, Ruth, or was it you, Alicia? It was pointing out that when any parent-child interaction is occurring, there is this sense on both of their parts that this is exclusive, this is special, this is about this event right here, right now, the two of us. And I think we all have experiences as adults when we're truly in communication with another human being. You're intently looking at the face of the other person, and you're really in sync. You're really reading that emotion and understanding.
So, actually, I want to highlight it was Peter.
It was Peter.
And it was the two pictures of which he had hoped his wife would pose, but he did instead. And the idea was that it wasn't just it wasn't pure contingency, but it was marking the internal state of the baby.
The two.
Right?
Yeah.
And that was brilliant, even though I know you had to put your own picture up there.
So again, if we know that, then let's go back to this idea of our machines and our technologies. Well, how come they get in the way? Why is it that we're so tempted in the middle of an exchange with a child? You see that between parent and child a lot, where it almost reminds me of the strange situation. Remember the experiment in which the parent suddenly turns away. But that's what happens every day with cell phones, that you're in the process of a deep interaction and communication, and it's ring, ring, buzz, buzz, and it's like all of a sudden, I mean, what is that doing?
Go ahead.
No.
I think we're scared of intimacy.
Speak up.
I think
Scared
we're
of intimacy.
intimacy. I think that unless we really take seriously the fears that we have about each other and about not being met, about not being understood, and how that feels like a reflection on ourselves, I think that we tend to flee into places that feel safely impersonal. And that's why in my talk, I focus so much on fears, because I think it's the unspeakable or kind of the side-tracked part of children's experience that goes on into adulthood. I think that those 4 people that you see in the restaurant are afraid of getting into things that might lead to conflict, might lead to disagreement, and it's just safer to put some distance, and that's what we see in avoidant attachments.
Finish. I actually do think that children and adults are afraid of being criticized.
Yes.
Children are criticized for many, many things. And so one safe way of avoiding criticism is to use your handheld device, communicate with your friends over a distance, and not have to worry about facing criticism, because we are a very critical culture here in terms of performance.
And the fear of disapproval is the salient fear of toddlers.
Yeah.
Will you love me? Will you approve of me? And I think it continues. And now parents are afraid of their children's criticism. Because given how much we appreciate individuality, everybody has a right to criticize their parents.
But I think you just touched upon that in the final sentence that you said is, it's hard to interact. It's hard to develop a relationship. And especially when you consider what Nathan emphasized today, which is individual differences is the definition of who we are. And again, that's, by the way, that's also conserved across species. Right? Individual differences are good for the health and welfare of the species so that everybody is not the same. But what does that mean? It means that we have to adapt and adjust. If I'm talking to Peter or if I'm talking to Art, recognizing differences in personality, differences in how they approach a conversation. Electronically, it's the same sentence that I'm probably writing to you. It's just, factual. But so it's challenging and it's not easy. And that's why I think that understanding this from the concept of how brain and behavior bring this is a skill set that we learn from the earliest time. And that's why relationships matter so much, to build this skill set, to be able to be adaptable, not just for yourself, but how you adapt to others. So those individual differences, which we love, are also the bane of our existence because they're so challenging to get through those relationships on a daily basis. Then it's easy to sort of understand why people in general want to sort of divert their attention to something that is a lot less complicated to deal with. Once you learn an app, you're all set.
Well, so let's take a translational shift here and start to think about, so if these things that we're uncovering in laboratories are true and we can verify them, they're not just beliefs, they're actual data repeated across laboratories, and not only in the United States, but the world. So parents and caregivers are dying for information. Whether they're wealthy people or they're people growing with children in poverty, parents want to know what to do. So how do we take these they are deeply about us as humans and how our brains work. How do we take these messages and package them for parents, policymakers, business people? Businessmen have to understand this too, or the economic argument's never going to work. Policymakers certainly have to embrace it, but parents and practitioners, daycare providers really need it. So how good are we at translating the messages? You can't just throw the data over the transom and hope that someone's going to put it into a program that works. How do we do that? And what messages would you codify as the scientist producing this elegant data? What are your top 3 messages for parents and practitioners? Or start with one, I'll make it easy. You don't have to have 3. You can speak up if you just have 1. Go ahead.
I would go back to what I said about that your humanity is more important than your knowledge or skill or doing the textbook perfect thing. Because you listen to us up here and you can get really scared. Because gosh, I have to make sure I touch this note and that note, and there are all kinds of, and really what you say is so much less important than how well you listen, right? Because the child needs to feel heard by you, really heard and seen by you. So it's the quality of your listening rather than the wisdom of anything you say that matters the most. So just be able to care. And that matters so much more than worrying about whether you've learned the 10 zillion things that you think you might need to learn.
Yeah.
I want to have 2 things to say about this. The first is, the National Scientific Council struggled over this, and I think what we came up with was that development occurs within a network of relationships. And so the important message here that we want to communicate is the importance of those relationships, and particularly positive relationships. That said, what concerns us and what concerns me is that there's so much information out there and so many different individuals who are communicating that information to parents that it would be difficult for anyone to filter that and to identify information which is going to be helpful for them. I don't know the answer
So
to how
that's
I don't know the answer as
complicated.
to how to sort of deal with that on a large scale.
We are trying now to translate what we learned about synchrony into an intervention with postnatally depressed mothers, and we developed an 8-session intervention that we are doing in the home. And I think what I learned from doing this intervention is 2 things. One is that it has to be delivered by a person of trust. So information that we will have on the internet is basically going to achieve the same problem that we're talking about. So in order for information to be meaningful to parents, It has to be dialogued by another person in a face-to-face personal interaction. And the second that we found very important is to be very concrete and to teach them about synchrony. It is important to be contingent with your child. It is important to mentalize. No, just like Ron said yesterday, the baby does I do the baby look at you, I look back. And these behavior building blocks accumulate and change, and it's amazing to see how mothers change their behavior and their whole approach to the child just by very concrete behavioral tips or instructions that are conducted within dyadic interactions of trust. So I would say, again, go down to the home, meet the parents, speak about concrete behavior of them with this specific child, and not about philosophy or statements or generalization, but something very concrete.
Yes, yes.
Alicia, you were going to say
I'd like
something.
to build on what Ruth is saying, which is, I think, essential, to extend it to social policy and wanting to treat parents and treat caregivers the way we want them to treat children.
Yes.
So that there is
That's a good point.
parental leave,
Yes, parental leave.
so that caregivers are enabled to have jobs that have health insurance, that have unemployment insurance, that have whatever, all the benefits and decent job salaries, so that they feel that the society is really, what the theme that we had before, is entrusting them and treating them the way we want them to treat the children. So doing more and talking less, which is what
Yes, doing more and talking less. Sounds like the economist ought to weigh in about now. Yes?
So I want to switch to the most vulnerable families.
Right.
And I think I mentioned about 10 years ago, I was invited to a Safe Haven, which is in Seattle, therapeutic approach. And most of the families that they were working with were court ordered. So we're with very vulnerable families. And again, back then I was very new to this whole area, and they convinced me, because I thought the issue was going to be abuse. And they said, no, it's neglect. And that they said they could fill a football stadium with families in Seattle where neglect is the problem. So the intervention here, what we have to think about is pretty basic. I'm not that concerned about middle-class families. I know they can get better, but I happened to go on, when I got back to Minneapolis, I went on some visits with some home visiting nurses, and we would go into these families, and they typically was a teenage mom with a boyfriend who knows where, and we'd go into their apartment, and the shades were pulled down, and the 6-month-old was in front of the TV, and the mother was on the phone. That we have to fix. So what the home visiting nurse did was she brings in a basket with some goods, a book, opens up the shades, and starts reading and talking to the mom as well as to the child, just to explain how important it is for her to interact with her child in a serve and volley positive way. That's a major breakthrough. If we can get that far in this country, it would be a huge benefit for a whole lot of reasons. So I think it's important to recognize, in some cases, they just don't have the information. They just don't understand how critical it is to interact that way with their child. And we need to social policy to overcome that.
Clyde Hertzman, who was a phenomenal epidemiologist and human being, developed something called the EDI, which allowed you to look at how well children were supported in the community on all different terms, socially, financially, etc. And so each different community in all of British Columbia, and now I think throughout Canada, has been characterized. And to people's surprise, the most vulnerable communities for kids, where the kids were at most risk, were not only the poorest, but also often the richest.
Yes.
And often that had to do with neglect. The parents were so busy doing their own things in their own careers that they didn't eat dinner with the kids. They sent them to summer camp. They weren't with them and the kids were having hardly any interaction with their parents.
Absolutely true. What's interesting is people have been mentioning what's happening in foreign countries. Again, most of us travel to foreign countries. What we're seeing is that the science being created in the United States is being picked up more by governments in foreign countries than in our own. It's very hard to see, because while you're cheering on the entire world, and you're going to Hong Kong and seeing these schools, infants, toddlers, and twos. I was there on Saturday morning when the fathers have to bring the kids to school or they don't get in. Fathers are the most significant male in that child's life, has to bring the child on Saturday mornings. And you see how governments in the Scandinavian countries, and I'm doing a project in Madrid right now, the science ministries and the policymakers in these countries are taking so seriously the data coming out of the United States. And they said, well, what are you doing in the United States? So I mean, we are not picking up on the research that's being created and funded by our tax dollars here in the United States to the degree that we should. So the mention of social policy and its need to change is an absolutely top scoring item on my list of things that we all have to work on. Peter, were you getting ready to say something?
Well, I think one important thing in terms of the translational aspect was that sometimes what we need to do is not actually that complicated. Mm-hmm. And it's neither complicated nor expensive, nor does it require massive social change. We have to be a lot more imaginative in what we do. Just one example. I mentioned briefly the study we're doing in Ethiopia with malnourished kids. It's a very strange phenomenon that when a mum has a malnourished kid, they seem to lose interest in that kid, even though the kid then survives, fortunately, because of UNICEF and other interventions. All that we did by way of intervention is to recruited some unemployed youth, of which there are many in Ethiopia, to teach mums to play with the kid. Mm-hmm. Yes. And we gave them just a little toy, and they would play with the kid, just teach mum to play with the kid. The kid, what we measured then was the kid's weight. And the kid gained weight at a very rapid rate. So it was a very simple way, because in malnourishment, the longer the kid is underweight, the worse the long-term outcome. So we could reduce that with an intervention that cost almost nothing. Mm-hmm. I think there would be a great deal that we can do that's simple, that actually would be highly effective if we just put the evidence we have to good use within our society. One other example that we did, we tried to intervene with schools to make them more mentalizing by just stopping teachers shouting at kids and saying, stop it. And having to ask, what is it that's going on? And finding out from other kids around what led to a piece of conflict. Education standards went up, violence went down. What I'm getting at is it's really taking our science seriously. Mm-hmm. Yes. That is, we know what the answers are, just having the courage of our convictions to go there, getting our hands dirty, and translating what we do into interventions. And sometimes, because that doesn't get you the next big grant, you actually stop short of that. Mm. Yeah.
Mm. Important, very, very important. Pat, please.
Yeah, so I'm going to, I don't have to repeat what else has been said. It's all very, very clear. To me, because I go out and speak to policymakers a lot, and I speak to people who are not scientists a lot, and I think nobody would disagree that what we've talked about today is so fundamental. So fundamental. And so you sit back and you say, well, if this were history, it would become a core, right? It would become a core that would be taught starting in elementary school or junior high school. I think the problem is that, we assume that all we have to do is translate the information and then it's going to be used by people who are in position to be able to make policy decisions. If we lack the creativity to on a level of education, how we're educating our children, adolescents, and adults in the area of brain science, right? And brain science, by definition, is everything. It's
Yeah.
chemistry, it's physics, it's math, it's humanities, it's art, it's music, it's biology, it's psychology, it's what isn't, it's economics, believe it or not, right? And so this is real, to me, it's straight, the more that we incorporate this into our fundamental knowledge base that we believe we all have to understand, then the conversation is much easier to have in terms of everybody understanding this is so important and fundamental.